I had never imagined that on a clear morning, enormous bulldozers would block the entrance to my house. And there was Karen Mitchell, the president of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, standing with a sinister smile. She had no idea who she was up against, or that the land beneath her feet truly belonged to me in the literal sense. If you found out that this detestable HOA board wasn't just illegally harassing you, but also stealing tens of thousands of dollars from your neighbors' pockets, what would you do? I still remember the day everything turned upside down. The gentle morning sunlight warmed my back as I knelt on the soft soil by the pathway, carefully planting the last of my carrot seedlings. After 20 years of living in stress, I had found peace in gardening. The dirt clinging to my hands, the smell of fresh grass, and the hope of home-cooked meals, that was the remedy keeping me sane. I'm Michael Carter, 48 years old, a retired lawyer after 20 years of grinding through 90-hour workweeks at a law firm in the bustling city of Denver. I was born and raised in the peaceful countryside of Colorado, where land isn't just property, it's the very breath of my family. After years of hustle, I moved to Pinewood Hills to find some calm, to let hands once accustomed to paperwork now touch the soil and grow lush vegetable beds. But I never expected that, in the very place I chose to rest, a storm of power and corruption would strike, threatening to tear apart my humble dream. Please leave a comment with the number 9 so I know you're ready to dive into the story of what I've endured at the hands of the HOA. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to join me for the tense developments waiting ahead. What the hell are you doing? I looked up to see Karen Mitchell standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed tightly over her expensive blouse. Her dyed blonde hair was stiff as a statue, her lips pursed in disdain. "Good morning, Karen," I replied, wiping my hands on my dirt-stained apron, trying to keep my tone calm. "I'm just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed, scanning the neatly arranged rows of vegetables along the path. "This is unacceptable, Michael. Front yards in Pinewood Hills must follow the approved plant list. Vegetables belong in the backyard, out of sight." I took a deep breath, suppressing the anger rising within me. Karen had been HOA president for the past 7 years, turning our once friendly neighborhood into a battlefield of absurd rules and surprise fines. "Karen, my land deed predates the HOA by 40 years. I have a special exemption from most of these rules." I stood up, feeling the stark contrast between my muddy jeans and her polished appearance. "Don't try that with me," she snapped, pulling out her phone with a triumphant air. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will hear about it immediately." I watched as she snapped a flurry of photos, her fingers flying across the screen. Two neighbors walking their dogs slowed down, their curious eyes glued to the confrontation. "I've read every line of the HOA agreement," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I still have the letters from the old board confirming my exemption. Want to see them?" Karen waved her hand dismissively as if swatting a fly. "Save it for the hearing. You'll get an official violation notice tomorrow. I suggest you clean up this mess," she pointed at my garden with contempt, "before the fines get worse." As she turned on her heel and walked away, I caught a sympathetic glance from Mrs. Lewis across the street. Just last week, Karen had fined her for painting her garage a light gray instead of the mandated dark gray. That night, true to her word, a glaring yellow violation notice was taped to my front door, a $75 fine per day until the unauthorized agricultural activity in my front yard was removed. The hearing was scheduled for 10 days later. I grabbed the paper and tossed it into a thick file labeled HOA nonsense. But this time I felt it was personal, a malicious attack that set my blood boiling. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Olivia Bennett, the kind elderly woman who lived at the end of the street since before Pinewood Hills even existed. "Michael, my dear," her voice trembled over the line, "I saw Karen giving you a hard time this morning. You're not the first. Last month, she fined the Morgan family $700 because their wooden ramp for their disabled son didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic." My blood boiled. How can that even be legal? "It's not," Olivia confirmed, "but they couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and fixed it." Karen's been getting worse ever since her buddy David became the HOA's lawyer. I thanked her and hung up, the anger keeping me restless all night. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper before stepping outside. My family once owned most of this land before selling it to developers back in the 1960s. My dad had mentioned keeping some special rights, but I'd never paid much attention. I was rummaging through old boxes in the attic when a rumbling sound roared outside. My heart pounded as I rushed to the window. For massive bulldozers blocked the driveway, trapping my car inside. Karen stood there in a crisp suit next to a tall man in an expensive suit I'd never seen before. Neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk, eyes wide at the scene. I gripped my phone and HOA documents, my anger turned into steely resolve. Karen had picked the wrong person to mess with. I stepped onto the porch, my pulse racing as Karen's smug grin sent a chill down my spine. The bulldozers growled, their drivers waited for orders. "Michael Carter," Karen shouted, her voice echoing through the neighborhood. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are too severe, and we're authorized to act immediately." The man beside her stepped forward. "I'm David Pierce, legal counsel for Pinewood Hills HOA. These," he pointed at my vegetable beds, "are unauthorized structures and will be removed under Section 6.2 of the bylaws, emergency measures for a public nuisance." The neighbors fell silent. Mrs. Harper covered her mouth in shock, and the Sullivan kids stopped biking to stare. I stepped down from the porch, my mind racing for a counter, but my voice stayed firm. "Mr. Pierce, you'd better check your legal footing. These aren't structures, they're just temporary garden beds. And more importantly, you're about to make a mistake you can't even fathom." David's smile faltered briefly. "Your threats don't scare us, Mr. Carter. We have full authority under the HOA agreement." Karen stepped closer, her eyes blazing with power. "Michael, why are you so stubborn? Agree to get rid of that ugly mess, pay the $450 in accumulated fines, and this will all be over." The bulldozers revved louder, the nearest driver glanced at me with unease. I pulled out my phone, my hand trembling with fury. "Before you do anything, I'm letting you know I'm recording this. I just texted a colleague from my law firm to come here. And there's one more thing about this land you should know." Karen rolled her eyes with disdain. "Don't pull your silly lawyer tricks, Michael. Nothing's stopping this." Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Neighbors parted as Sheriff Holloway stepped out, followed by a woman clutching a thick stack of county records. Karen frowned, then panicked. "What's this? A petty HOA issue doesn't need the police." I gave a faint smile, feeling a spark of hope for the first time that day. "Karen, you don't know whose driveway you just blocked, and you definitely don't know whose land your bulldozers are parked on." The county clerk, Mrs. Coleman, set a pile of weathered maps on the sheriff's hood, sweat beading from the weight. Neighbors crowded around, whispering excitedly. The bulldozers fell silent as the drivers sensed the shift. "This is the original survey map from 1965, Mrs. Coleman explained, pointing to the yellowed paper. "And this is the land sale contract between the Carter family and Pinewood Development Company." Karen stormed forward, her voice shaky but still defiant. "Nonsense. Whatever ancient papers you drag out, they don't override the HOA's authority." Sheriff Holloway cleared his throat. "You'd better listen to what Mrs. Coleman has to say." The clerk adjusted her glasses. "According to the records, when the Carter family sold the land for development, they retained 3 rights. First, mineral rights beneath the entire 150 acres of the neighborhood. Second, ownership of underground utilities under the main road. And third, most importantly, exemption from any future homeowners association for the 4 homes they kept." I stepped forward, my voice steady. "My house is one of them." David Pierce rifled through his briefcase, his face paling. "Impossible. The HOA agreement applies to every property in the area. There's nothing about exemptions." Mrs. Coleman smiled calmly. "That's because your HOA was established in 1988, Mr. Pierce. These agreements were filed with the county in 1965. Your rights can't supersede a prior contract." Karen's face turned crimson, her hands clenched so tight they went pale. "This is a scam. Even if Michael's house has some privileges, he still has to follow community standards." "Actually," Sheriff Holloway interjected, "under county law, he can do whatever he wants on his land as long as it doesn't violate zoning. And a vegetable garden is perfectly legal." The crowd grew larger. I saw Mrs. Lewis filming with her phone. Mr. Harper whispered explanations to his son. Karen spun toward the bulldozer drivers, barking orders. "This changes nothing. Proceed with the removal as planned." But the lead driver shook his head. "Sorry, I'm not risking my license on disputed land without a court order. If you want me to do this, get a judge's approval." "I'll get that order today," Karen screamed, seething with frustration. I stepped closer to Karen and David, my voice lowering. "You don't know the half of it yet. Those 4 bulldozers are sitting on utility land I own per these very documents. That's blatant trespassing. And since you brought them here to tear up my property," I paused, letting the heavy silence weigh on them. David quickly tugged Karen's arm, whispering urgently, his breath ragged. Karen's eyes widened, flashing with panic, a look I'd never seen in someone who always considered herself untouchable. "Sheriff," I turned, my voice firm despite the fury burning in my chest, "I request an immediate report for attempted vandalism and property trespass." Sheriff Holloway nodded, flipping open his notebook with determination. "All right, let's get started. This is outrageous. Karen fumed, her voice shrill and cracking. The HOA has run this neighborhood for 25 years. You can't just spring special privileges out of nowhere. A frail but commanding voice cut through her rage. Mrs. Olivia Bennett stepped forward slowly, her cane trembling in her hand, her eyes blazing with resolve. It's not out of nowhere, Karen. Some of us here have known about the Carter family's exemptions for years. The old board honored them, but things changed when you took over. Karen whirled around, her eyes spitting venom. Stay out of this, old woman. Don't forget your Halloween lights next month. You think I've forgotten? The crowd gasped. A few indignant murmurs rose at the blatant threat against the respected 85-year-old woman. Olivia smiled faintly, but her voice sliced through the air like a blade. I forget nothing, dear. My mind's still sharp. I clearly remember your chicken coop encroaching 3 meters onto Mr. Phillips' land and how you used David here to hush it up with an internal decision, didn't you? The crowd's murmurs grew louder, neighbors' eyes now brimmed with suspicion and anger. Karen's fists tightened, her breathing heavy, her face flushed as she realized she was losing control. David Pierce glanced at his watch, his voice shaky. Karen, we should step back and discuss this privately. Maybe we need a formal meeting. No meetings. I cut in, unrelenting. My land is outside your jurisdiction. Move those bulldozers off my property now, or I'll add more charges. Sheriff Holloway stepped forward, his tone low but authoritative. Everyone, stay calm. Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Pierce, have the drivers move the machines immediately. Mr. Carter, we'll file the report once the area's clear. Karen's eyes darted around, wild, like a trapped animal. Neighbors who once feared her now stood tall, their gazes flickered with curiosity and satisfaction. This isn't over, Michael, she snarled. I'll show you. As the 4 bulldozers slowly pulled away, Mrs. Olivia touched my arm lightly. Her voice was a whisper laced with meaning. Michael, there's something serious you need to know. It's about the HOA's financial records. What is it? I asked, my chest tightening. She glanced around cautiously. Not here. 8 o'clock tonight, come to my house. Bring your land documents. I think we've only scratched the surface of the mess Karen's made. As Karen and David scrambled into their car, I saw the tremble in their movements, raw fear they couldn't hide. They thought destroying my vegetable garden would end this, but now they realized they'd unleashed a storm they couldn't control. The last bulldozer rolled away, my carrot bed still stood strong. Sheriff Holloway approached, notebook ready. Ready to file the report now? I watched Karen's car speed off, a fierce determination swelling inside me. Absolutely. And Sheriff, you might want to call the district attorney. I have a feeling this goes way beyond a simple trespass. Before walking off, Mrs. Olivia squeezed my hand, whispering, 8 o'clock tonight, Michael. Bring your laptop. You'll need it to face what I've found. My blood ran hot as the bulldozer's rumble echoed in front of my house. Neighbors peeked through windows, watching the tense drama unfold. My hand shook as I dialed, my voice was urgent as I called the county office. Mrs. Coleman, it's Michael Carter. Remember those land records from 2 months ago? I need them at my house right now, it's an emergency. Karen stormed across my yard, strutting as if she owned everything, pointing at my vegetable beds and barking frantic orders at the drivers. David nodded repeatedly, scribbling on his clipboard. You've got 45 minutes to say goodbye to that little garden of yours, Karen yelled with a cloying sweetness that felt suffocating. Next time, follow the rules. I replied coolly, don't touch anything until Mrs. Coleman gets here. Who's Coleman? Karen snapped, her eyes flickering with unease. You'll see. The next 35 minutes felt like a drawn-out nightmare. Neighbors gathered across the street, whispering and speculating. Some were sympathetic, others seemed amused. Mr. Dawson held up his phone, filming the whole scene. Mrs. Coleman's car screeched in after 32 minutes, bringing a team of clerks and 5 hefty boxes of documents. Karen's smug grin vanished. What's all this? David demanded, stepping forward, hand outstretched. I'm David Pierce, HOA legal counsel. Mrs. Coleman ignored him. Diane Coleman, county clerk. I was alerted to a dispute over historic land. I smirked as I helped her spread an old map across the hood of her car. The oldest sheet was dated 1895, the first transaction of my great-grandfather. Ms. Mitchell, Mrs. Coleman began, pointing to a boundary line. Are you familiar with the Carter Land Trust, established in 1918? Karen crossed her arms, her voice was sharp. This is a farce. HOA bylaws clearly state, your bylaws hold no weight against county law, Mrs. Coleman interrupted. I pointed to a section of the documents. The 1969 land sale, when my grandfather sold lots to Pinewood Hills. Look at this. David snatched the paper, his eyes widened in shock. The Carter family retained mineral and subsurface utility rights, Mrs. Coleman explained. Mr. Carter's home is exempt from all subsequent regulations. Ridiculous. Karen shouted, furious. You know that special infrastructure fee everyone pays yearly? I asked. That money belongs to my family's trust, paid for the subsurface utility rights we own. The drivers exchanged looks, one shut off his engine. Those bulldozers are parked on my land, I declared, my voice steely. That's trespassing. Karen lunged forward, trying to grab the documents. I need to see this. It's a trick. A police siren wailed, lights flashing as a cruiser pulled up. Sheriff Holloway stepped out, nodding to me. Ms. Mitchell, we've got reports of vandalism and trespassing here. This is HOA business. Karen screamed. It's county jurisdiction, Holloway countered, notebook in hand. Mr. Carter's grandfather's contract spells it out. David whispered to Karen, his face drained of color. Stop this now. If they're telling the truth, it can't possibly be right. Karen shrieked, her voice breaking. But I saw the panic in her eyes. The crowd of neighbors swelled, murmurs rose as another car pulled up behind the sheriff's. Mr. Dawson was now live streaming, the phone's glow illuminating his excited face. Karen's tone suddenly softened, sickeningly sweet. Michael, we can settle this amicably, can't we? Sheriff Holloway stepped forward, notebook open, his voice firm. I need those bulldozers out of here immediately. The drivers were already scrambling to their machines, clearly eager to escape the chaos. But what happened next stunned everyone. The back door of the car behind the sheriff swung open and a familiar figure stepped out, someone no one expected, someone who would turn this fight completely upside down. Stop those machines right now. The voice belonged to Mrs. Olivia Bennett, the 85-year-old widow who lived 4 houses down from me. She leaned on her cane, moving slowly, but her eyes blazed with unyielding fire. Karen rolled her eyes, her tone dripped with sarcasm. Olivia, go home. This has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me? Mrs. Olivia chuckled, the sound sharp. When you dared fine me $750 for my Halloween lights last October, you dragged me into this. I'd rarely seen Mrs. Olivia since helping her with paperwork after her husband's death 2 winters ago. She usually kept to herself, seldom seen. Mrs. Bennett, Sheriff Holloway said, maybe you should. I'm exactly where I need to be, she cut in, turning to me. Michael, show them the 1969 map. I hesitated, surprised, but quickly pulled it out. Mrs. Olivia raised a trembling hand, pointing to a section of Pinewood Hills. Look here, 10 lots, including my house, were part of the original sale agreement. Michael's not the only one exempt from HOA control. Mrs. Coleman leaned in, adjusting her glasses. She's right. The original homes all have similar protections. Karen's face twisted, her reaction trembled. Absurd. The HOA has managed those houses for years. Managed illegally, Mrs. Olivia replied, each word resolute. She turned to the crowd. Mr. Henry, Mrs. Clara, Mr. Victor, your originals too. 3 elderly residents stepped forward, their eyes held a mix of shock and curiosity. Is that true? Mr. Henry Brooks, who'd lived on the corner for decades, asked. They can't make me take down my TV antenna or fine me for my birdhouse? Mrs. Clara Evans added. I saw realization dawn in their eyes, years of being bullied by the HOA, paying undeserved fines, altering their homes under rules that didn't apply to them. David pulled Karen aside, whispering urgently, her face darkened by the second. But Mrs. Olivia wasn't done. She faced the crowd, her voice rang out. How many of you have been harassed by this HOA, fined for nonsense, threatened with lawsuits over petty things? Hands shot up everywhere, comments on Mr. Dawson's livestream surged. This isn't just about Michael's garden, she continued, but about how the HOA under Karen has abused power relentlessly. Sheriff Holloway nodded. His tone was low. In the past 18 months, I've gotten dozens of complaints about this HOA, threatening seniors with heavy fines, ticketing visitors' cars without notice, entering people's property without permission. Karen shoved David aside, her face red with rage. These accusations are pure fabrication. We're just enforcing rules everyone agreed to when they moved in. No, not everyone agreed. I shot back. And you know that, don't you? The air grew thick. Tension felt suffocating. The bulldozer drivers had fully retreated from the driveway, clearly wanting no further part in this. This isn't over, Karen hissed at me. The board will handle this. Speaking of the board, Mrs. Olivia interjected, reaching into her large purse. She pulled out a thick stack of papers and handed it to me. I opened it, My lawyer instincts kicked in: bank statements, transfer records, company and corporation documents. "How did you get this?" I asked, my chest flooding with astonishment. Mrs. Olivia smiled faintly. "My husband was an accountant for 55 years before he passed. After the Halloween light fine, I got curious about where that money went. So I requested public records. I flipped through the pages, each one a damning revelation. The HOA collected special fees from every home for park upgrades. Yet the park remained as run down as it was 5 years ago. Over $450,000 had vanished into a company called Pinewood Ventures, LLC. The final page listed the managing members: Karen Mitchell and David Pierce. Karen realized what I was looking at and lunged to snatch the stack of documents. "That's internal HOA property." Sheriff Holloway blocked her. "Step back now." The crowd pressed in, buzzing with curiosity about what was happening. David quietly slipped toward his car, but no one noticed. "These are serious allegations," Mrs. Coleman said, peering over my shoulder. "If these documents are real, this isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It's criminal." Karen's confidence shattered. She roared at me. "You don't know who you're messing with. My husband dines with Judge Grayson every Saturday. This will all disappear by Monday." I locked eyes with her. My voice was icy. "You should catch up on the news, Karen. Judge Grayson retired last month after an ethics investigation." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Mr. Dawson zoomed in close with his phone. Mrs. Olivia placed a hand on my shoulder, whispering, "There's more, Michael. So much more." As the sheriff began taking statements from neighbors, I wondered how deep this corruption ran, and who else was involved. Either way, this community was about to change forever. My hands trembled as I opened Mrs. Olivia's file. Bank statements marked with orange notes highlighting odd figures. The HOA had been collecting an extra $400 a month from each household for park repairs. Yet the park looked no different from 5 years ago. Over $450,000 gone. I whispered, my finger tracing the column. "Where did this money go?" Mrs. Olivia leaned in. "Keep flipping." The next page showed the funds flowing into Pinewood Ventures, LLC. I looked up, my mouth dry. "Karen Mitchell and David Pierce," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They've been stealing from us for years." "How did you figure this out?" I asked, my mind reeling. Her eyes glinted with pride, tinged with sadness. "My husband taught me to read statements before he passed 45 years ago. When Karen fined me $300 for keeping my Halloween lights up 3 days too long, I got fed up and started digging through the HOA papers no one bothers to read. I pulled out my phone. "We need to tell everyone now." "Wait!" Mrs. Olivia grabbed my hand. "Look at the last page." The final document revealed Karen and David's plan to use HOA rules to force 6 elderly residents to sell their homes cheap, then buy them through their company and resell at triple the price. My blood ran cold. "They targeted the vulnerable," Mrs. Olivia said. "People like me. Living alone, easy to intimidate." Sheriff Holloway, who'd been listening quietly, shook his head. "This isn't just an HOA issue anymore. It's fraud." I stood tall. My decision was clear. "I'm calling an emergency meeting tonight." For hours later, I stood in a packed meeting hall, chairs full, people lining the walls, even crowding outside the windows. I hooked my laptop to a big screen, displaying each page of evidence. "The people we trusted stole $450,000, I said, my voice steady despite the fury boiling inside. "Money for park repairs, roads, playgrounds, all gone." Gasps filled the room as I pointed out the money trail. When I revealed the scheme to force out the elderly, outraged shouts erupted. "Where are Karen and David?" someone yelled. "They were invited but didn't show," I replied. "Their absence says it all." Mr. Dawson, a retired judge from the corner, stood up. "I move we vote now to dissolve the current board and appoint interim leaders until a formal election." 82 hands shot up in agreement. Neighbors lined up to sign the legal papers I'd prepared. My phone buzzed Karen's name on the screen. I stepped outside and answered. "You've ruined everything," she screamed, panicked. "You think you've won because your family once owned this land?" "It's not about winning," I replied calmly. "It's about justice." She scoffed, the sound hollow. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Michael. Your precious garden is just the start." The line went dead. I stood in the cool air, wondering what she'd try now that the whole neighborhood knew the truth. Inside, people formed teams to audit HOA finances and simplify rules. Mrs. Olivia sat amid the crowd, recounting her discovery, every eye fixed on her. My phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. Check your security camera now. I opened the app, my stomach knotted. Two dark-clad figures appeared in my front yard. Despite the dim light, I recognized Karen's blonde hair and David's tall, lanky frame. They were yanking out my vegetables, tossing them everywhere. I handed the phone to Sheriff Holloway, who immediately called for a patrol car. On the screen, Karen stared straight into the camera, grinning wickedly, making a throat-slashing gesture before they sped off in a car. A second text arrived. This is just the beginning. When I'm done, you'll wish you'd never planted a single seed. Can we catch them? I asked, my chest swelling with worry. Trespassing, vandalism, and with this threat, maybe more, he replied. But be careful, Michael, cornered people are unpredictable. Mrs. Olivia took my hand, her voice was warm. You're not alone anymore, none of us are. Looking at the resolute faces around me, strangers just days ago, I realized she was right. Karen and David once had money and power, but we had something stronger, truth and unity. My phone buzzed again, a text with a photo, my exemption document, scrawled with red ink. Roots burn easy. I jolted awake to the sound of breaking glass. I raced downstairs and found my kitchen window shattered, my garden completely destroyed. The camera caught Karen and David wrecking it at 2 in the morning. I texted Mrs. Olivia right away. Within 45 minutes, 7 news vans parked outside my house. Reporters swarmed. Did the HOA president trash your garden after you exposed her theft? They asked. By noon, 40 neighbors showed up with seedlings and shovels. We've got your back, Mrs. Lewis, someone I barely knew said. Karen fined me $750 for a birdhouse once. Sheriff Holloway arrived, papers in hand. Karen and David are in custody, he said. The county found $450,000 missing from HOA accounts. That day, we voted to replace the HOA with a friendly neighborhood group, drafting fair rules that let people garden and live freely. 2 months later, we held a big party in Karen's old front yard, sold after she went to prison. The new family supported our community garden idea. You changed everything, Mrs. Olivia said, handing me the season's first carrot. I smiled faintly. I just wanted to grow vegetables in peace. I didn't expect to save the neighborhood. The story of Michael Carter and his fight against abuse of power and corruption in Pinewood Hills reflects a modern societal truth. Unchecked authority can lead to injustice and harm for a community. From small acts like imposing absurd rules to grand schemes like embezzling money, this tale reminds us that unity and perseverance can defeat those who misuse their positions. Through the story, we can draw a positive lesson. When faced with injustice, seek the truth, connect with like-minded people, and use legal measures to protect your rightful claims. It's an inspiration for everyone in today's society to speak up and act for justice. This story is purely for entertainment and education, not intended to discriminate, criticize, defame, or offend any individual or organization. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread these positive values. Thank you for listening to this video. Wishing you a peaceful day and see you in the next videos.